A cold November wind blew into the suburban house. Carol Watson sank into her favorite armchair under the soft living room lights, holding a newly acquired mystery novel. Even at 65, she remained captivated by the scent of printed words and the worlds within stories. Late-night reading had become her habit. In the 2 years since losing her husband George, she had tried to fill her lonely nights with fictional worlds. The small bookstore she had run for 35 years in Northampton had become her very reason for living. Her daily routine consisted of enjoying conversations with regular customers during the day and immersing herself in stories at night. Just as the clock was about to strike 11:30, the sudden sound of the intercom broke the silence. At this hour, Carol adjusted her glasses as she stood up. The entrance monitor showed 2 uniformed police officers. With her 35 years of experience running the bookstore, she was confident in her ability to read people. The older one appeared to be in his mid-50s, the younger one in his early 30s. Their expressions carried a sense of urgency. The last time the police had visited was that day 2 years ago. The news of her husband's accident. Falling down the stairs. Shaking off the resurfacing memories, Carol pressed the intercom button. "Is this the residence of Mrs. Carol Watson?" "Yes, that's me." As she opened the front door, cold night air rushed in. The senior officer presented his badge. His expression, illuminated by the streetlight, carried a hint of tension. "I'm Officer Johnson from the Massachusetts State Police." "This is difficult to say, but..." The officer hesitated for a moment. That brief pause heightened Carol's anxiety. "Your grandson has been found chained up in the basement of a facility in the city." Carol felt as if time had stopped. A ringing sound filled her ears. "But I don't have a grandson." When she responded with a trembling voice, the officer's expression froze. The younger officer behind him clearly couldn't hide his bewilderment. "What did you say?" The officer's confused voice echoed in the midnight silence. Carol's heart began to pound violently. She hadn't been this shaken since losing her husband George to the stair accident 2 years ago. "We'd like to discuss this in detail. Would you mind coming to the station with us?" Carol glanced back at the living room. On the table lay the book, still open to the page she'd been reading, a cup of warm tea, and an unfinished knitted scarf. The peaceful everyday life that had existed just minutes ago suddenly felt like a distant world. "Please wait a moment. Let me get my coat." Her steps toward the upstairs bedroom felt unusually heavy. As she climbed the stairs, Carol thought about her son David. As a local newspaper reporter, he occasionally went on business trips. Recently, he seemed to be pursuing some major story, and his visits had become less frequent. When they met after church last Sunday, he appeared troubled by something. She took out a navy blue coat from the bedroom closet. It was the last Christmas present from her husband. Looking at her reflection in the mirror, the graying hair, the deepening wrinkles, she saw an ordinary elderly woman who had managed a small-town bookstore. She knew David was still single, but a grandson. On her way back downstairs, she paused in front of the study. Her husband's desk remained untouched. Just before the accident, he had said he'd found some important documents. Now she would never know what they contained. As she got into the police car, the younger officer began explaining. His voice carried a note of concern. Your grandson's emergency contact was listed as David Watson. However, we couldn't reach him at the newspaper where he works, and you were listed as David's emergency contact. Street lights passed by the car window. Carol remembered her 35 years at the bookstore. Her husband sweeping the storefront before opening at 8 a.m. Regular customers dropping by on weekends. Members of the church reading group. College student customers. David doing his homework in the corner as a child. What had been happening beneath those peaceful days? The police car drove quietly, arriving at the station in the dead of night. Just before entering the building, Carol looked up at the sky. It was a dark night without a single star visible. Something was about to begin. Something that would shake her life and everything she knew to be true. The heavy entrance door opened with an ominous sound. Despite the late hour, the police station's consultation room was filled with an unusual tension. Carol sat in a hard chair, clasping her hands tightly on her knees. The wall clock was about to strike midnight. Sorry to keep you waiting. A female social worker entered the room. She appeared to be in her mid-40s. Though her eyes seemed kind, her expression was tense. I'll bring in the boy. At those words, Carol's heart began racing. The door opened, and a small boy entered. He appeared to be around 12 years old. His thin frame looked as fragile as a twig about to break. However, what caught Carol's attention was his face. It couldn't be. The boy looked exactly like David. The resemblance to her son when he was in high school over 20 years ago was striking. Carol's hands began to tremble. My name is Ethan. The boy's voice was surprisingly calm. However, in his eyes lurked an indescribable loneliness. David Watson is my father. The air in the room froze. Carol caught her breath. Ethan continued. But I've never met him. Professor Thomas said my father abandoned me. The boy's words were cut off by a sudden fit of coughing. The social worker hurriedly offered him water. Carol started to stand up, but at that moment, hurried footsteps were heard from the hallway. Mom! David burst into the room. His usually neat hair was disheveled, his tie askew. He clearly appeared to have been called away from work. And when his eyes met Ethan's, the blood drained from David's face. Ethan! He called the boy's name in a hoarse voice. Ethan took a step back, moving closer to the social worker as if seeking protection. While we can't make any definitive statements until the DNA test results come back, the police officer began explaining. Based on Ethan's testimony and physical characteristics, no test is necessary. David interrupted. His voice sounded more anguished than Carol had ever heard from her son. He is, indeed, my son. Carol felt the world spinning. David rushed to support his mother's shoulders. Please, let me explain. David took a deep breath and began to tell the truth from 20 years ago. It happened when he was a sophomore in college. A romance with Mary, whom he met in the literature department. Her pregnancy. Following the suggestion of their mentor, Professor Thomas Green, they decided to place the child in a care facility. They were too young. Mary wanted to establish herself as an artist. David was pursuing his dream of becoming a journalist. Professor Thomas promised to find good foster parents. David's voice trembled. But why was Ethan in the facility? That's the core of this case. A new voice rang out. A tall male detective had entered the room. We have strong suspicions that multiple children at the facility run by Thomas Green were subjected to improper treatment. Ethan's testimony is crucial to our investigation. The detective's words began to fade in Carol's ears. Various memories crossed her mind. The documents her husband had been examining before his death. Thomas's unnatural behavior when visiting the bookstore. And above all, the existence of her grandson, Ethan, standing before her. Suddenly, Ethan spoke in a small voice. "I've been to Grandma's store." Carol snapped back to attention. The boy continued. "I would secretly go there, to read Dad's articles in the newspaper." At those words, tears welled up in David's eyes. Carol quietly stood up and approached Ethan. She gently placed her hand on his thin shoulder. "From now on, you can read as many books as you like." Carol's voice was surprisingly steady. The confusion and questions hadn't disappeared. But for now, she would focus only on the child before her. No matter how cruel the truth might turn out to be. Outside the window, the dark night continued. But dawn would surely come. Until then, she needed to prepare herself to accept this new reality. And to bring the hidden truth of this family into the light. In the consultation room at the police station, despite the late hour, Ethan's testimony recording had begun. Carol and David watched from the adjacent room through a monitor. The boy's thin fingers gripped a paper cup tightly. At first, it was a normal facility. Ethan's voice trembled slightly through the speaker. But things changed 6 months ago. Professor Thomas started talking about special education and taking some children to the basement. The sound of David's fist hitting the desk echoed through the room. Carol placed her hand on her son's arm. Ethan continued. "When I heard that Dad, Mr. David, had come to investigate the facility, Professor Thomas's behavior changed. He said, 'Your father is a dangerous man.'" Ethan's profile on the monitor looked exactly like David's. Carol's memory drifted back 20 years. That morning when her son announced he would take a leave from college. George had been furious. But Thomas Green had intervened, seemingly settling everything amicably, or so they had thought. 2 weeks ago, I was locked in the basement, Ethan's testimony continued. The other children disappeared one by one, but he said I was the trump card for negotiations. The interrogation room door opened, and an FBI agent entered. Ethan's testimony had the potential to develop into a case spanning multiple states. "Let's take a break," the social worker suggested, and Ethan moved to the adjacent room. Carol offered him warm cocoa. She could feel his hands still trembling slightly. "Mrs. Watson," a voice called from the hallway. "Could we discuss your husband's case?" Those words sent a chill down Carol's spine. David leaned forward, but Carol quietly raised her hand to stop him. "All right." Moving to another room, the detective produced a photograph. It was security camera footage from the day of the accident. Your husband appears to have been arguing with Thomas Green just before the accident. Carol's memory raced to that day. Her husband had been obsessively examining documents. Old receipts, facility financial reports, board meeting minutes. He said something was wrong, Carol began quietly. That there were suspicious points in the facility's accounts. Actually, the detective leaned forward, we found evidence of substantial under-the-table payments involving adoptions through Green's facility. And the first person to notice these financial flows was George, wasn't it? Carol's voice trembled. Everything was starting to connect. Meanwhile, David had opened his laptop. His investigative notes listed inexplicable facts about the facility. Missing children. Suspicious adoption records. Enormous donations. And Mom, David lowered his voice. What if what Dad was investigating at the end was about Ethan's records? Tears welled up in Carol's eyes. Her husband had known about the existence of their grandson and about the abnormal situation he was in. Ma'am, the detective spoke, we believe this was likely not a simple accident. At that moment, commotion erupted in the hallway. Emergency! Thomas Green has escaped from the facility. David jumped to his feet. Where's Ethan? Everyone rushed to the room where the boy had been, but only the social worker lay collapsed on the floor. The window was wide open, letting in the cold wind. We'll seal off the area immediately. Police officers rushed away. Carol stood by the window, looking out. In the distance, beyond the fog-shrouded streets, sirens began to wail. David embraced his mother's shoulders. We'll find him. Just then, Carol's cell phone rang. It was an unknown number. With trembling hands, she answered. Mrs. Watson, a familiar voice resonated. If you want to know the truth about George's final moments. On the other end of the line, she could hear Ethan's small sobs. A tear rolled down Carol's cheek. The sun was beginning to rise, marking the start of a new day. But this day would change her life forever. Carol quietly gripped the phone. The truth her husband had died trying to protect. And her grandson, who had just been taken away. She had to stand up to recover everything. The basement of Watson Books. Carol was relaying the contents of Thomas's phone call to the police. Memories from 20 years ago played in her mind like an old film. Back then, Thomas had visited the bookstore twice a week, ostensibly as an antiquarian book collector. But thinking back now, his visits must have had a different purpose. Mom, these receipts, David was spreading out old account books. Having returned to the bookstore with police permission, they were desperately searching for clues her husband had left behind. From 1999 to 2004, regular sums of money every month. The receipts were made out to Green Educational Fund, an educational foundation established by Thomas. George was, Carol furrowed her brow, the accounting auditor for that foundation, wasn't he? Yes, her husband had also been a member of the city's child welfare board. While in a supervisory position over Thomas's facility, why hadn't he noticed the fraud? Or perhaps... Let's check the back storage room, David stood up. The police forensics team had also arrived, and the search quietly began. As she descended the stairs to the storage room, Carol remembered a scene from 20 years ago. "What a wonderful collection of rare books," Thomas had said while gazing at the shelves. A tall man with refined features, he was trusted by everyone as a university professor. "This," he picked up a book, "is a valuable first edition." That day, Thomas had unusually stayed late at the store, having a serious conversation with George. When Carol tried to approach, they abruptly ended their discussion. "Leave David's matter to me," Thomas had said before leaving. Shortly after, David returned to university, and everything seemed to have been resolved. "Mom, look at this," David's voice brought Carol back to the present. They had found an old safe in the back of the storage room. The combination. Carol took out her husband's notebook. On the last page was a meaningful sequence of numbers. 35-24-17. The safe opened with a heavy sound. Inside were a notebook, a USB drive, and... "This is..." David picked up an envelope, "mine and Mary's." They were adoption papers from that time. However, the official institutional seals were clearly forged. "He knew everything, didn't he?" Carol's voice shook. Her husband had been gathering evidence of Thomas's fraud for years. And when he found the final piece of evidence... Just then, Carol's cell phone rang again. "Are you ready?" Thomas's voice echoed. "Let's discuss all the truth now." "Give Ethan back," Carol managed to force out the words. "Ah, he's fine. A clever boy. Looks just like David, doesn't he?" Ethan's voice could be heard in the background. "Grandma." George, Thomas's voice turned cold, stuck his nose where it didn't belong. "Just like David. You were involved in Dad's death. Come to the old church within 30 minutes with the notebook and USB drive. Just you. If you contact the police, I can't guarantee Ethan's safety." The line went dead. Carol took a deep breath. "Mom, it's dangerous." David tried to stop her. "We should call the police." "David," Carol looked quietly at her son. "We can't afford to lose anyone precious to us again." Mother and son faced each other in the dim storage room. The morning sun streaming through the window tinted the dusty air golden. Carol clutched her husband's notebook to her chest. This was the truth George had died trying to protect. And now, that truth was being demanded in exchange for her grandson's life. "I must go." Carol's voice was surprisingly steady. There was fear, but no more hesitation. Her husband's final homework. The time had come to solve it. David silently draped his mother's coat over her shoulders. Their shadows stretched long in the morning sun. The spire of the old church loomed faintly through the morning mist. St. Mary's Church, where Carol and George had married 35 years ago. Carol's footsteps echoed quietly through the now unused chapel. "Thank you for coming." Thomas stood before the altar. His former intellectual air had vanished, leaving him looking like an exhausted old man. Ethan sat tied to a chair beside the altar, his wrists bound. "Ethan, are you all right?" "Yes." The boy nodded weakly. "Did you bring the documents?" Carol quietly took the notebook and USB drive from her bag. To think George had gathered so much evidence. Thomas gave a bitter smile. He was such a perfectionist. Never did anything halfway. Why? Carol's voice trembled. Why did you do all this? Thomas heaved a deep sigh. It all began 20 years ago. On the surface, it had been an ideal adoption system. Thomas's facility was known as one of the state's most highly regarded childcare institutions. But in reality, it was a gateway for an international human trafficking organization. Children disappeared into the shadows under the pretext of special adoptions with wealthy foster parents. It started with small lies, Thomas's voice echoed. David and Mary's case was just a coincidence at first. But that's when I realized this system could. Clever methods, forged documents, and enormous funds. Carol's husband George, as the city's auditor, had gradually begun tracking traces of the fraud. George must have become certain when he saw Ethan's papers, Thomas continued. That David's son actually was sold. Carol's voice was ice cold. Yes. But call it a conscience, perhaps. I kept him close. Using a child of David's blood in this business. So father. Ethan spoke with a trembling voice. George was a gentleman until the end. Thomas's eyes gazed into the distance. Let's resolve this through discussion, he said. But I couldn't turn back anymore. The fall down the stairs. A perfect disguise. But just before his death, George had hidden all the evidence in the safe. And now David started investigating too, Thomas said irritably. Like father, like son, sticking his nose where it doesn't belong. Doesn't belong? Carol's voice grew stronger. After ruining children's lives, you say it doesn't belong. Just then, the sound of sirens approached from outside. You didn't. Thomas looked out the window. Yes, Carol stared directly at Thomas. My bag has a GPS tracker. I couldn't risk putting David's son in danger again. As Thomas hurriedly drew a gun, the back doors burst open with a loud bang. FBI. Don't move. Special forces in black uniforms stormed in. The gun fell from Thomas's hand. As Ethan nearly tumbled from his chair, Carol caught him instinctively. Grandma. Ethan's body was trembling. Carol held her grandson tightly. It's all right now. You're not alone anymore. The morning sun streaming through the windows gently enveloped them. The door opened again, and David rushed in. Ethan. Mom. As the three embraced, Carol looked toward the altar. The place where she and her husband had made their vows 35 years ago. Now, new family bonds were being forged here. Thomas was led away in handcuffs. His back no longer carried its former dignity. Behind him, an FBI agent informed Carol. Ma'am, we've found several more children at the facility. And leads on the international organization. Carol nodded quietly. The evidence her husband had gathered at the cost of his life was about to bear fruit. David gently stroked Ethan's hair and said, Let's go home. To our home. As they left the church, Carol looked back. The morning sun shone through the stained glass, casting colorful lights dancing on the floor, as if blessing their new beginning. Yes, this wasn't an ending. Their story with their new family was just beginning. One snowy morning in December, a "Now Open" sign stood in front of Watson Books. It was their first day of business in 3 months. Inside, Ethan was helping organize new books. "This is the complete Sherlock Holmes collection, isn't it?" Ethan gently stroked the old leather-bound book. "Yes," Carol smiled. "It was your grandfather's precious collection." 3 months had passed since the incident. Thomas Green's trial continued. The FBI investigation was revealing the full extent of a human trafficking organization that had operated for over 15 years. 26 children had been rescued, and internationally wanted suspects were being arrested one after another. David's series of articles, "The Lost Children," had gained national attention, leading to a review of the supervision system for childcare facilities. "We have customers." Ethan turned at the sound of the entrance bell. "Good morning." Local women came in one after another, carrying warm dishes. They had brought food to celebrate the reopening. Members of the church book club brought homemade cookies. "Ethan, how have you been? Are you keeping up with your homework? Haven't you grown taller?" The community had naturally accepted Ethan. In fact, they seemed genuinely happy about the birth of a new family. "Mom," David came down from the second floor. "Ready for Sunday's speech at church?" For the charity event supporting child care facilities. Carol was scheduled to speak from the podium. She had decided to help create a new monitoring system, carrying on her husband's will. "Yes," Carol gazed at an old photograph. "I think your father would be happy about this." In the back of the store, Ethan was reading a picture book to a young child. He who had once feared human contact now showed natural smiles. "Hey, Grandma," Ethan closed the picture book and ran to Carol. "I wrote this." The manuscript paper he held out had a story written in childish letters. "My new family." Carol felt tears welling up in her eyes. "Dad told me. Grandpa was a hero who fought for justice." Ethan's eyes sparkled. "So I want to become someone who can help others too." David embraced his son's shoulders. His former guilt had transformed into quiet determination. Carrying on his father's will, and building a new future with his son. At dusk, after the last customer had left, the three were preparing to close. Ethan stood by the window, watching the continuing snowfall. "Hey," Ethan said. "Do you think this snow is a present from Grandpa in heaven?" Carol gently embraced her grandson. "Yes. I'm sure he's watching over us." Warm lights glowed inside the store. Countless books on the shelves waited to meet new readers. David sat at the back desk, writing tomorrow's article. The articles would continue to tell the truth. And another page was about to be added to their new story. Carol changed the sign to "closed" and turned the key. The bell above the door made a small sound. The snow continued to fall quietly, as if promising a new day. Tomorrow, this small bookstore would open again. There would be books, truth, and above all, a loving family. Carol looked up at the sky. "Thank you, George." Those words gently dissolved into the falling snow. It was a story that began with a midnight visit. lost truths and new bonds. And now, their story continues to add new chapters. The snowy night was just the beginning.